Hi, and welcome back to our lectures on blockchain fundamentals. Today, we're going to talk about some of the most fundamental aspects of a blockchain, public key cryptography and one-way functions. So, we are dealing with cryptocurrency, usually, on the blockchain, and so it really behooves us to understand what is cryptography, since that is the crypto in cryptocurrency. So cryptography has a lot of different uses. It is just concealing what you are saying somehow. The oldest use for cryptography is encryption. That is, if Alice wants to talk to Bob, how can she communicate with him in a way that any eavesdroppers, in this diagram represented by Eve, would not be able to listen in and understand what she is saying to Bob? Just so you know, Alice and Bob are sort of the canonical two people who wish to talk when we discuss cryptography. Eve is an eavesdropper. Mallory is going to be someone who is malicious. Charlie or Carol are going to be third parties that are neutral. But this is a regular cast of characters that we'll see when we discuss cryptography. So how can Alice send a message, M, to Bob, but without allowing Eve to understand the message, even if she sees it? Well, we can encrypt it. The oldest form of encryption is called symmetric key encryption. And this is a case where both Alice and Bob have access to the same or related keys. So Alice can encrypt a message using this key. So using our encrypt function, you can see Alice, she creates the cipher text, that is the encrypted text, C, by passing the message M and the encryption key, K sub E, into the encryption function E. This will give us some encrypted text. She can then send it to Bob, who can decrypt it using the same K sub E encryption key, but taking the ciphertext, we'll run those two arguments through the decryption function to get what's called the plain text message, the original message that Alice had sent before she encrypted it. Now, Eve, viewing the network, is only going to see the ciphertext C and never the actual message M. So she'll be able to see encrypted text going by, which to her should look like gibberish, and unless she knows the K sub E, the encryption key, even if she does know the algorithm being used, she should not be able to decrypt this text. So let's start with a very, very simple encryption algorithm known as the Caesar cipher. So the Caesar cipher has been around for thousands of years. All that you do is convert the letters of the alphabet to their equivalent numbers. So for example, A is 1, B is 2, C is 3, etc. Then we have some key, K sub E, and let's say it's 5. And then in order to get the ciphertext, we're just going to add that key value to each individual number, and then get the letter that is equivalent to that. So assume that if we assume that our key is 5, if we have a letter A, we're going to encrypt it by adding 5. A is 1. We add 5 to it. That is 6. The 6th letter of the alphabet is F. Okay. To decrypt it, as long as you know K sub E, as long as you know that the key is 5, and you subtract it, when you see the ciphertext, you can take that letter, convert it to a number, and subtract 5. You just do the inverse. So you can see why this is really symmetric. You're doing a symmetric operation to get the original text back. So let's just walk through a simple example of a Caesar cipher. So our message M is attack at dawn, and our key, K sub E, is 5. We're going to go through each character and apply our encryption function E. So the first letter, the first character of our message is A. So that is equal to 1. Applying our encryption function E, we add 5 to 1 and get 6, so that it's F. For the second character, T, that's equal to 20. We apply our encryption function E, we get 25, that's Y. Continue doing this for every character in the character sequence, and we come across our ciphertext C, FYY, FHP, FYI, FBS. I've included some Ruby code there if you would like to follow along with this very simple cipher. Somebody looking at FYYF ... will not be able to understand that it is attack at dawn. And that is why it's ciphertext. It is not the plain text. It is now hidden from anyone who is interested in viewing this. However, if you have the key, K sub E, 5, and I know the encryption function, D, which is just subtract 5, I can apply the decryption function to each character. So we see I subtract 5 from 6, I get 1, which is A. I subtract 5 from 20, I get 20, which is T. I do this for every character, and I now see the plain text attack at dawn. And so I now know that I am supposed to attack at dawn. But Eve, who was looking over the network and seeing what we were able to communicate, who was eavesdropping, she only sees FYY, whatever, and she doesn't know when we're going to attack, even if she sees that there was a message sent to us. So something that I mentioned here is that Eve knows the algorithm. This is known as Kerckhoffs Principle. You need to assume not only that someone may be viewing the data that you're sending over, but they may even know the specific encryption algorithm that you're using. So the secrecy of the system should depend upon you knowing the key, not knowing what algorithm is being used. So there's a term for this, security through obscurity, and that is generally not a good defense. If you assume that nobody else knows what algorithm you're using or what your functions are, it is very easy for that information to be propagated outward, for even somebody to discover what kind of algorithm you're using. So when you're developing a crypto system, you should never be thinking that people are not going to know the algorithm that you use. You should assume that the secrecy lies only in the key and not in the algorithm. So, looking at our Caesar cipher, hopefully you can see that there are some weaknesses in this. So even if you didn't know the key, which again is supposed to be the single thing that keeps our system secure, what are some other ways to break the Caesar cipher? This is a very almost like childlike cipher. Is extremely simple to break, and it's one of the reasons why we don't use Caesar ciphers in any modern cryptographic system. So first off, you can do a frequency analysis on it. That is, if we assume it's in the English language, we know, for example, that E is the most common letter. So if we look through all of the ciphertext and look for what is the most common letter, and make an assumption that it's E, or perhaps one of the other very commonly used letters in the English alphabet, and then the second most common letter in our ciphertext corresponds to the second most common letter, we often can make very educated guesses as to what the original plain text was. Frequency analysis was definitely used quite often in breaking a lot of early modern cryptographic systems. Known plain text attack. So this is another attack on the Caesar cipher. If I know that attack at dawn translates to FYY ... then it's going to be trivial for me, assuming I know the algorithm, to determine that the key is 5, because I'm able to get from the plain text to the ciphertext by adding 5, and from the ciphertext to the plain text by subtracting 5. Finally, again, if I know the algorithm, it's very simple for me to do a brute force attack. That is, just try all of the different possibilities of numbers to add. And since in our example we were using only capital English letters, there are really only 26 possibilities, right? Anything that's more than that would just be, because we're doing modular arithmetic, we would just loop around more than once. So 27, for instance, would be the equivalent of 1, or 28 would be the equivalent of 2. And so there are only really 26 possibilities for a key, but we can then subtract even one more possibility, because having 0 or some other multiple of 26, we're going to get the exact same plaintext as we passed in. It's not going to be very much of an encryption if I add 0 to the letter and subtract 0 to decrypt it. I'm just back to sending out plaintext. So we can see that there are a variety of attacks that are possible on this very simple encryption system. And the kinds of attacks that are possible on more complicated cryptographic systems, while they won't be quite as simple to implement or explain here, they follow many of the similar ideas. This should give you an idea of how cryptographic systems can be broken. So besides just sending encrypted messages over the network, something else that is going to be very useful and very important in terms of cryptocurrencies and blockchain technology is authenticating via encryption. So let's assume that Eve has upped her power level, and now not only can she eavesdrop on the network, but she can actually modify messages in flight. Okay? So she could send her own message to Bob. Alice sends a message, but Eve intercepts it and sends her own message. So how can Bob verify that Alice was actually the one who sent a message and not Bob? That is, we got message M and not M prime. Well, assume that Bob and Alice share a separate secret key, K sub A, our authentication key. And they know an authentication function, K sub A M, which is going to give some value A, which shows that it has in fact been authenticated. So this could be a function, for example, that we add a certain number of characters to get a particular result or a particular hash function. But what we can show is that when Bob receives a message, he can tell that it was signed by Alice or not. That is, she has included this key. Think of it almost as like a mathematical secret code that if I tell you that you'll know it's me if I say the word seagull whenever we meet, or when we meet at the train station. So you can think of this as a mathematical version of that. We can then combine these two aspects, encryption and authentication, by including our authentication message inside the ciphertext. So we both encrypt it and add authentication. And that way, when Bob receives the message, he'll be able to know, one, that the message came from the person he thought it was coming from, and two, others besides Bob will not be able to read that message. So we now have a very powerful mathematical way of communicating and proving who we are. However, there are some weaknesses with this approach. So in symmetric key encryption, Bob and Alice need to know the same key. How do they get that information to each other? They need to share those keys, K sub E and K sub A, in some separate secure channel. For example, offline or on a secure network, etc. But if they have some separate and secure channel to communicate, why would they then use an insecure one? So it turns out there are, in fact, several reasons that you would want to do that. If I want to communicate with somebody online, I may talk to them offline at some point earlier in time to exchange keys, and then later I will be able to use these keys that we exchanged to talk online, or at a place where we don't have that secure channel available. We now can communicate over an insecure channel. So there are some reasons to do that, but it still raises the question, when do I have a chance to interact with this person in a secure way? This is certainly something that we don't want on a large-scale network or system where I may not know all the people that I'm interacting with. If I'm sending Bitcoin to an address I've never heard of, or to somebody that I only know online, then how am I supposed to set up a secure channel with them so that they can prove who they are? So there are some definite weaknesses in symmetric key encryption. And that's why asymmetric key encryption came along. So you may have also heard of asymmetric key encryption as public key encryption. So in asymmetric key encryption, there are two different keys. One which is used to encrypt messages to you, and a separate one that you use to decrypt. So we usually refer to these keys as P and S. P is your public key, and anyone who knows this public key can encrypt a message to you. But only you, the person that owns the secret or private key, can use it to decrypt the message. So what you can do is publish P anywhere. You can publish it on a blockchain, you can publish it on the internet, put it in your email headers. It doesn't matter. You can publish it anywhere. And then anybody who wants to communicate with you in a secure way can encrypt their messages to you using the public key. But only you that own the private key are able to decrypt these messages. So, as its name implies, it is really best for you to keep this key private. So, as an example here, Alice would like to communicate with Bob. She does not have a secure channel to talk with Bob to exchange keys in symmetric keys. However, we can actually do this entire message sending entirely through public channels, even if Eve sees all the data going across the network. So remember, Bob is going to tell the world what P sub Bob is. That is, what his public key is. But he will keep his secret key very secret. He will not allow anyone else to know about it. Alice would like to communicate with Bob. So she encrypts a message M with Bob's public key. This is going to generate some ciphertext. That ciphertext is sent over the network. Again, we can assume that Eve would see it. But Bob is going to be the only one who can decrypt it. He needs to have S sub Bob in order to convert that ciphertext back to the plaintext message M. Now, if Bob would like to respond to Alice, he can look at Alice's key and encrypt a message to her using her public key. So he creates a ciphertext message using Alice's public key, again, entirely unrelated from his key. So this is not symmetric key encryption. There are two different keys, key sets that are used by each of the players in this communication. Just like Bob, Alice will be able to decrypt the ciphertext and convert it into the plaintext using her own secret key. So Eve, through all of this, is only going to see ciphertext over the network. And Bob and Alice are now able to communicate even though they never had a secure channel to share that symmetric key. So if you're interested in more detail about this, I have a link here to the paper, New Directions in Cryptography, that was published in '76, that really pointed the way towards this new generation of cryptography and really marks the beginning of modern cryptography. So you've probably heard, or you may have heard of Diffie and Hellman. They're the two authors of this paper. You may have heard of Diffie-Hellman key exchange. So we're not going to go too much into depth about how this works behind the scenes. You can just sort of accept that for now that public key cryptography does work. But they aren't just two random values. They are related. You need to generate them together. There are a few different ways to do that. Bitcoin and many other systems use elliptic curve cryptography. So to generate this key pair, it uses something called ECDSA. But there are other possibilities. There are a lot of different ways to generate these key pairs. But again, for now, I think it's sufficient to just understand the concept that you can publish your public keys and people can encrypt messages to you, but keep your private keys private because that's how you are able to decrypt those messages. If you've already used Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies, you probably see a parallel here to cryptocurrencies, even if we haven't brought it out directly. Everybody can know your public address. It's fine to let people know your address so they can send things to you, so they can send tokens to you. However, in order for you to control that address, you have a private key, which you must keep secret. So we can see here there are a lot of reasons that cryptocurrency is in fact called cryptocurrency. There is a lot of cryptography involved in it. One problem with asymmetric key information exchange, it turns out that it's actually rather inefficient. It's relatively slow. So what you'll see with most modern systems is that if there are two entities that wish to communicate, they will first establish a secure communications channel using asymmetric encryption, which is slow but does allow us to exchange information over a public network in a secure way. Once communication has been established, then they can use that to share a symmetric encryption key. So that is the private channel, the private secure channel that they've generated. Before, we discussed that as just being offline and interacting with somebody, but now we can see how we can actually generate a secure channel over a public channel, sort of overlaid on top of the public channel. Once we've done that, we can share the symmetric encryption key, and then for further communication, we can use the much faster and more efficient symmetric encryption to communicate between the entities on the network. So one question that arises from this is, how do I know that P sub Bob is actually Bob's key and not Eve's or Charlie's or Daniel's or Evan's? Right? This is very important, for using the internet today. For instance, I want to make sure if I'm buying something that I'm at Amazon.com and not sending money or accessing a website at Amazon.com. So there are a variety of different approaches to this. This is called public key infrastructure. How do we associate identities with particular public keys? So what you may have been used to, if you've seen a certificate on a website, you may have seen like, oh, this certificate is bad or out of date. There are a variety of centralized authorities on the internet that will say that, okay, this particular public key is associated with Amazon.com or Foo.com or whatever. And many of these are actually built into modern web browsers. Many of these different certificate authorities. So you can check to see, all right, is Amazon.com associated with this particular public key according to this authority? There's a web of trust. So instead of this more centralized system of certificate authorities, I can say, well, I have met Alice and Bob in person. So me, Bill, I trust Alice and I trust Bob. And then Charlie comes along and he says, all right, Bill, who do you trust? And he says, well, I trust Alice and Bob. And Charlie says, well, I trust Bill, and Bill trusts Alice and Bob, thus I can trust Alice and Bob. So this is we can see how this would grow as we trust people. But we can also see how it would get unwieldy once we get past a few degrees of separation. There are a few other approaches out there, some blockchain approaches, but those are probably the two main ones. Although you can see that there are some trade-offs here. With a web of trust, it can be very difficult because you're having to trust the different people around you and making sure that they didn't make any mistakes in who they should trust. But with certificate authorities, you have a very centralized system. Another problem with web of trust is, how do you trust people that you may have no connections with or only are very distantly connected with them? Most cryptocurrencies today do not have any public key infrastructure built into them. So if you have the private key to an account, then you own the keys associated with that account. There's no centralized authority that says, oh, this address on Bitcoin belongs to Bill. It's only, I can say that Bill has said that he owns this address, but do I trust that Bill communicated that with me correctly and that was in fact Bill? Okay. So because there is no public key infrastructure, this has led rise to a famous saying, not your keys, not your coins. That if you don't own the private keys, you don't really own the coins. So if an exchange is holding them for you, they really own the coins. There is, again, no public key infrastructure. There's nothing out there saying, oh, even though those coins are on this particular exchange, they actually belong to me. It's only up to the exchange to keep track of, oh, these actually belong to this person or that person. So that's public key cryptography in a nutshell. I want to briefly go over the concept of one-way functions because it will be very important in the next lecture when we talk about hashing. So a one-way function, or also called a trapdoor function, is some function y equals f of x, where if you have y, it is computationally infeasible to calculate x. But given x, it is possible, and often generally easy, to calculate y. That is, it's much easier to calculate going in one direction than another. So just as an example, looking at this not as a computer, but rather as a human, assume that our quote-unquote one-way function is the square function. So y equals f of 27, it's relatively simple for you to do, even by hand. 27 times 27 equals 729. But if I asked you to calculate the square root of 729, this would be much more difficult. It may take you a while. You may have to guess a little bit at it. So here we can see, not a true one-way function, but one that it is much more difficult to go backwards from. Again, very easy to calculate the square of something, much more difficult to calculate the square root. This, take this up to even more higher levels, right? So like calculating the fifth power of something. Once again, very simple. If I have some number, I just multiply it by itself 5 times. However, if I asked you for the fifth root of something, that's going to be very, very difficult for you to calculate. So obviously, computers have much harder algorithms that they will try to reverse, but it's the same basic idea. It is much, much, much more difficult to go the opposite way, the inverse, to get the original value back than to initially calculate it. So just as a side note, no function has been proven to be entirely one way. That it is definitely impossible to only go one way. So in the applied cryptography world, we say only that it is computationally infeasible to do it. Even if it hasn't been proven, we're relatively confident that it will be extremely difficult or basically impossible to do. One-way functions are going to be very important when we discuss mining and understanding that. They're very useful for proving that a hard computation has taken place, but without revealing any interior details or secret values of that calculation. However, we're going to talk much more about one-way functions in our next lecture on hashing.